I guess I'm just gonna have to look at myself this whole time. All right. Hi, y'all. Welcome to the Inheritance of Europe podcast.
Not too bad.
No, it's not. My guest is
Yeah.
Evan Loganov, and we're talking about World War I today.
We'll be talking about World War I and its immediate aftermath, roughly the years of 1914 to 1920. And this is shorter than the amounts of times we covered in the last one, but it's probably just as, if not probably more important, just given how World War I was world-shaping.
Very consequential.
Yeah. So, the last part we covered the kind of the lead up to World War I with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the alliances being made, along with the kind of the blank check Germany gave to Austria against Serbia. And this one, so I'll start with the start of World War I. The start of World War I begins on the Western Front mostly. And that is that Germany, they did Luxembourg. We want to just come through your lands, and we're going to. Belgium, probably a little stupidly said, "Oh no, we're not going to do that because of their national pride." And so they declared war and invaded Belgium. They kind of just rolled through it pretty decisively, and then that's when they came to France. Their plan was to kind of just roll through France, but the Battle of the Marne was the first battle France and Britain, basically. That's when a lot of the lines were drawn. Basically, the war kind of became a little bit of a stalemate then.
Yeah, and at the same time, you have the campaign in the Eastern Front with the Austrians fighting the Italians and the Germans fighting the Russians, and sometimes the Austrians fight the Serbians and the Russians. But actually, the Austrians conquered Serbia for like a very short period of time, and then they were overconfident, and they kind of there was a counterattack where the Serbians took back Belgrade, and they ended up the Austrians more or less got kicked out of Serbia. And that was kind of the decline of any civic pride in the Austrian campaign on the Eastern Front. The Italians.
Yeah, Austria had long been surpassed by Germany. And Italians, yeah.
The Italians, all they were really doing was trying to defend themselves from Austria-Hungary, and they had a guy called Luigi Cadorna, who was their main field marshal, and he had some early success. But then he blundered at the Battle of Caporetto so badly that they just kind of got rid of him and replaced him with someone else. But it was like this weird situation where, the Italians defended against the Austrians, but they fucked it up so bad at this battle that it was an ugly, it was almost like a Pyrrhic victory, the whole campaign for them.
Well, yeah, the Italians were on the side of the Entente. They were mostly fighting the Austrians in the northern kind of Alps.
And they had an alliance at the beginning of the war with Austria and Germany, but the part of their alliance stipulated that they could decline participation if Austria or Germany started a war. And in this case, they started it with Serbia. So they didn't actually break their alliance by declaring neutrality in 1914.
Okay. Yeah, they didn't. But the Eastern Front was another thing. The Eastern Front, unlike in World War II, was actually not the biggest theater of the war. It was kind of the Soviets were they weren't the Soviets then, but the Soviets would come from this.
They'd become the Soviets afterwards, though, for sure.
Yeah. So there was the Battle of Tannenberg, which was the kind of biggest battle on that field. And that was considered like a huge loss for the Russians. They were on retreat for most of the time after that. But still, they wanted to join the war effort and continue the war effort. They obviously it was a losing war, and that caused a lot of discontent on the home front.
Were you the one telling me that you had a relative who was at Tannenberg?
No. I'll get into that later. That's
Okay.
about the Russian Revolution.
Okay. But there's a lot of famous statesmen who came out of the Tannenberg battle, because Tannenberg meant, as a victory, meant a lot for the German Empire, because it was sort of a retaliation against a battle in the same location 800 years ago, also called the battle. Also called 600 years ago, right? Also called the Battle of Tannenberg. And in that case, the Germans actually lost, but in this case, they won. And so they're the hero of the day. Because the celebrities, right, were Paul von Hindenburg, they named the blimp after him, the airship, right? And then they also have a guy called Erich Ludendorff. But these guys are actually ended up being instrumental in the ascendancy of the Nazi Party later on. So they seem like good guys in World War One, but by the time of World War II, they seem kind of like dicks.
Well, most Nazis, almost without exception, the founders were veterans of World War One.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Who were kind of embarrassed about what Germany had become and wanted to fix it. But that we'll get to the Nazis probably in the next one. And some of the biggest battles were, first of all, there's Verdun, which is considered one of the bloodiest battles of all time. In the fact that the Germans were trying to seize the fort of Verdun, which was considered a very strategic location, and there was I think it was over 1 million people lost, and a little bit more on the French side and some less on the German side, but very heavy casualties on both sides in 1916. And then there was one that more involved the British, which was the Battle of the Somme.
And then there was the Passchendaele. Yeah. And then there's the 100 Days campaign.
Right. Yeah, the Somme, it's known as one of the one of the days when the British were kind of, making a kind of, attack on the German lines. This is one of the bloodiest single days of battle of all time.
Yeah, well, in some of these battles, they lasted a month, and other battles, they lasted like half a year. And in some cases, the casualties were 100,000. In other cases, the casualties were 1 million. So, or almost. So it's in the Western Front, it was curious because it was so located in that sort of Flanders, borderlands area. And all the battles like Ypres and all these places, they're all Belgium, the Netherlands, France. It's not Germany and France tend to fight in that same kind of northern area. And the British are always kind of roped into it, looks like. They actually had a lot of good leaders, the French, even though the French had a technological disadvantage to the Germans because they weren't as industrialized. There's all these things, all these reasons why the French were kind of lagging, and they needed the British to help them. Also the Australians, the Canadians, the Americans, right? They needed all the support, but they actually had some really good leaders. And you have to remember, this is only 100 years after Napoleon. So they're thinking about I'm going to be like a great general, like Ferdinand Foch or Philip Pétain, or the guy, I forget his name, but there's a guy who said they shall not pass. They shall not pass. And he said that on the radio over and over again. And these guys, they were embodying this sort of Napoleonic, for this thrust. But at the same time, they had to curtail it because they didn't want to be this tyrannical conqueror. So it's a very interesting personality some of these French generals had at this time, because this is obviously the most important war they've had in 100 years. But how do they live up to their own military tradition? And yet they have to rely on so many allies. They're not really the leaders in this case. It's the British that are the leaders.
Yeah, France probably had more of a personal vendetta against Germany because of losing Alsace-Lorraine in the Franco-Prussian War. That was the first place they invaded when the war started. The Germans invaded the line and they invaded Alsace-Lorraine. They ultimately did end up getting it back after World War I, and still had maintained it today. So they ultimately won that battle in the long run. But in World War II, obviously,
they wanted to fight, but they brought all these people into their war with them. The guns they had, the rifles, the infantry had were single shot rifles that only had 4 bullets in a chamber. And then going into World War I, the Germans had guns that could shoot 8 bullets. And they were the bolt action or whatever. So they could shoot they could shoot twice as fast basically as the French could. And
another thing that's unique about World War I.
I'm not finished. 1 sec. And the other thing is that going into World War One, there was a large pacifist movement. There's probably aligned somewhat with the socialist movement, but they were really in France and they in Paris and all this, and they had the leading pacifist figure whose name I can't remember speak right before the war was declared against Germany, and he was saying like, "Do you guys want to start a world war? You guys are crazy." Like, he was yelling at everyone in the audience, and a guy runs up and shoots him and assassinates him, and he's the leading pacifist figure in France. And then and then he's literally the next day or so he's exonerated for killing this guy because the murderer was exonerated for killing the pacifist leader because they thought that the pacifist leader was not like a good, you know what I mean? They thought he was an enemy of the state, essentially.
Yeah, well, World War I was definitely used as an excuse to crack down on domestic social movements in a lot of these countries, certainly. And also, another social change on the war front that wasn't necessarily true in past wars is that this is one of the first wars that most of the deaths were actually from combat, not from disease, malnutrition, or exposure to the elements like what happened in past wars.
Yeah, and they also had all this. They also had mustard gas and Zyklon B and things. It's like
there was also a war where most people would never like even see the face of the person who killed them because like it was all in trenches. It's kind of just a stalemate. Occasionally there would be charges. Very rarely there would be kind of people coming into trenches and hand to hand. That would happen, but that was like a very small amount of people killed that were killed that way.
Well, he did march out into no man's land, just get shot on arrival, the DOA, and
it was kind of like a decision, like a lot of people, did like most people had no wanting to go into no man's land, so it's either like they.
Well, I know. Well, what it was is the logical extreme of the line formation from the pike and shot era or whatever. It was like they were just stand in the line and charge, and then basically to their demise. But it was like the technological extreme of that, to the point that it became just madness to do it.
Yeah, and this is where like ideas in modern warfare, like being shell shocked, like just kind of like losing your sanity because of what's going around you, kind of come from World War One.
That's where the term shell shock comes from. It's from World War One, and and they were living with the rats and stuff, they were poorly fed, and they were getting diseases, even though they were dying faster than they were dying from diseases. They were still getting them, and they had tanks that were killing people constantly. Machine guns were being implemented for the first time on a large scale. They had airplanes that were fighters mostly, but towards the end of the war, you started to see bombers, and that really fucked people up. And of course, these planes, you look at them now, they look so puny. They're biplanes or monoplanes in most cases, which means a monoplane is just a plane that has, a one wing, one set of wings, a plane, and then a biplane has two, and they're kind of connected at the ends. But then there's the Red Baron, is the most famous fighter in World War I, and he actually died at one point. But he actually had a 3-layer plane called a triplane. And he was famous for being really into that when no one else was really using them.
Well, yeah, and there was also, there were buildups of large navies before World War I. That's another thing. But even though World War I, the only major naval battle was the Battle of Jutland, which is kind of the northern German sea.
Yeah.
But they had built up huge navies. It didn't really turn out to be that much of an aspect.
Well, I'll tell you one thing about those navies, man. I gotta give it to the Germans in this, because as much as America was the most industrialized country and all this, the Germans are the second most industrialized at this point, I believe. And they were, because of that, they were able to take a very puny navy that was almost non-existent and make it extremely, extremely viable and sizable. And they were the only country in the world, and maybe even in all of history, to do this. And it was just because of what they could do with an industrialized landscape. And the ability to just create such a large navy all out of nowhere is kind of like it's no matter what your opinion is on the German, politics, that's an impressive thing. No matter who you are. So I think I'm really baffled by it.
That's kind of a huge aspect of when you saw, the planes were big. Another thing is tanks. The first tank was in
I mean, just creating warships out of nothing and they did that in World War II also. The tanks were not very effective in World War I, but they used them just because it was like they were just barely effective. Like they were marginally better than like having soldiers. It was more for like defending people, I feel like, than it was for attacking.
Well, yeah, there was definitely like a lot of technology was kind of innovated for the purpose of this war. I mean, like a lot of the early sort of cars, what we consider were put into more heavy use because of this war, and where they're going to domestic use.
They still used horses, not just cars, but they were starting to phase horses out.
Yeah, horses were still heavily used in this war, and even some places today they're still used. But I mean, so that's a lot of the technology in the war. But on the Eastern Front, I'll go back to the Eastern Front.
Well, we have to remember that Bulgaria was also a central power, and the Ottomans were a central power. And so
okay, we can get into a little bit the Ottomans. So the Ottomans, there was the landing at Gallipoli where they tried to fight them. They were really weakened them, but they still sided themselves with the kind of the Germans of the Central Powers. One of the famous things that happened during that was there was a man named Lawrence of Arabia, and they made a famous movie about him in the 1960s. Where his job was basically, he was a British man. He was sent for the purpose of stirring up rebellions among the local Arab populations against the Ottomans, so they'd be easier to beat, and that did happen. And the Ottoman Empire was no more at the end of World War I, so you could say it was a huge success.
He didn't topple the Ottoman Empire, though. He prevented the Ottomans from fucking with those Arabs, But he didn't like topple it yet. But yeah, no, the Ottoman Empire though at this point was actually had a really good military in terms of they were competent, but they weren't very well equipped, and they operated mostly defensively. But the Gallipoli campaign was and that was implemented by Winston Churchill because he had a high position in His Majesty's cabinet or government or whatever, and Winston Churchill was really forced the hand of the Royal Army and Navy to continue with Gallipoli, even though when it was obviously showing that Gallipoli was a failure. Basically, he really wanted Gallipoli to work, even though it was just beyond possibility. And it ended up being just this Pyrrhic victory for the Ottomans because they lost almost 1 million people, and so did the British and the Australians. But but it ended up being a tactical failure for the British, and it was really an embarrassment. And you keep in mind the British, they fought all over the world at this point. They were fighting in China against the Japanese in a very small skirmish in Qingdao, I believe, and they were fighting in Italy as well, and they're fighting all over the map. And as far as World War I is concerned. But that Gallipoli campaign ruined Winston Churchill's reputation, and even until World War II, until the middle of World War II.
Well, yeah, definitely. But going back to the Eastern Front, so Russia was, as I said earlier, not really doing well in the war, but they still kept in. And this is where a lot of the background to the Russian Revolution comes. So there were multiple movements most of them were socialist or social democratic oriented. There were the Bolsheviks, who were the hardliners, like the hardline kind of revolutionary communists. Then there were the Mensheviks, which were the more moderate sort of, socialists. They were social democrats. And eventually there was just so much unrest in Russia that the Tsar was overthrown. What's called the February Revolution. And then they put into place a provisional government that was under Alexander Kerensky. And there were multiple flaws with the provisional government that would ultimately lead to it being overthrown in October. One is it didn't have any really unifying ideology. Most of the people in it were like moderate sort of social democrats, and basically but they weren't like as ardently, communist or as the Bolsheviks later were. So they didn't have any real kind of solid, ideological basis. Another is they didn't end the war, and that was one of the major reasons for the cause of the revolution. So basically the fact that they didn't end the war was not going to make them popular. And then in October, what would happen is there were these things called Soviets, which are kind of local, what would be called worker councils run by Bolsheviks or revolutionary communists. And eventually these gained so much power that they were kind of, more powerful than the government in a lot of areas. And they basically, kind of revolted and took over, from Kerensky and formed their own government. And they actually did negotiate a treaty to end the war. And one of the major leaders was Lenin. He was actually in exile a lot of the times. He was exiled from Russia because he was considered just a subversive and they didn't want him there. But the Germans actually let him come back to Russia, basically, because they thought this would sort of later turn out to be not such a good idea on their part, seeing what happened in World War II. But they thought he'd be a rabble rouser and would weaken Russia internally. And he, of course, did. I mean, before forming the Soviet Union, he was like agitating against the war. And but then this would lead to what's called the Russian Civil War. That we'll get into a little more of that later. But basically, the anti-Bolshevik elements fought the pro-Bolshevik elements, and there were brutal bloodbaths on both sides, repression. But the Tsar had,
and then the Mensheviks got taken out also.
Yeah, they did. But the Tsar was still alive, even after the October Revolution. He was held kind of as a hostage in Yekaterinburg.
Nicholas II, yeah,
in part of Russia. And so later in 1918, he was executed. Officially, it was on the orders of the local sort of authorities within the Soviets of Yekaterinburg, but most people think Lenin had a direct role in it.
Yeah, Lenin and Trotsky, perhaps. Did Stalin get involved in this early on? Was he around?
Yeah, Stalin was involved in the party. I mean, he's doesn't feel more prominent until later.
Yeah, and obviously Stalin wasn't his real name at this point either, probably.
He was Georgian, yeah. Stalin's Man of Steel.
Yeah, he's literally Superman. No, but I want to make a note on these the rulers at the time. Obviously, we have the Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, and then you have Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, and then you have Tsar Nicholas II of the Russian Empire. And what I find fascinating is that they're all kind of fucking up. The actual monarchs are kind of losers at this point. I mean, obviously, like you had Otto von Bismarck, who wasn't a monarch, he was a chancellor, and he got kicked out of politics in Germany because he was sort of getting too old to do the job. He was getting a little crazy. Like he might actually fuck up Germany if they kept him running it. So they kind of ousted him. But then Wilhelm II was not an idiot, but he was sort of like he didn't understand like how fucked up like the machinations were with all the different factions in Germany. He didn't understand that people were manipulating him all the time. He was very idealistic, but he wasn't like an idiot. Like he liked to, he had like good ideas. He was just he ended up abdicating. He ended up abdicating because he was way in over his head. Obviously, Nicholas II gets.
Well, yeah, that's afterward. After World War I.
No,
yeah, Nicholas II.
And Nicholas II obviously gets executed by Lenin. His whole family does. The Romanovs, and
the whole family.
And then the only one that is kind of cool was Franz Joseph II, because he'd been in power since like 1848, since basically the era of revolution in the 1800s. He had running a dual monarchy, which is like this ridiculous thing where he's like one crown himself, but he represents two different seats of government. So he's like the emperor of Hungary and he's emperor of Austria at the same time. And he was able to keep that ship together, so to speak, for decades upon decades. And it was only because his heir got assassinated that the war broke out. Like he actually was living through the war. So it's a very, very interesting. You feel bad for the guy. I mean, he seemed like he knew what he was doing for the most part.
Well, yeah, another thing, this is kind of a little off topic from what we were talking about, was there was these events at Christmas time in the trenches, actually, where like normally like
yes,
each other getting blown up, and there was usually this thing called a Christmas truce, where people from both sides would go to each other and exchange presents or show pictures of loved ones to them, and then like they knew beforehand that they'd be back to trying to fight and kill each other at like within a week's time. But
Yeah.
they still did that, and it's just kind of some amazing, kind of, show of humanity in this kind of really, dark period.
It was so mechanical and bleak that I think that even like killing people, you weren't killing. It was an anonymous murder, so you may as well. It's like if you're going to go and kill people anonymously, you may as well like have a moment where you actually meet someone and have a party. I mean, because it's not going to make a difference. You're not going to see them again. There's so many soldiers in these large scale operations. You're not going to go and see that person that you gave it fried chicken to or whatever, or showed a trinket or whatever. You're not going to see that person. You're not going to kill them. So you may as well. I actually think that's cool.
Yeah. And those were only.
It's just so mechanical. Yeah, it's almost like they were networking or something for until war ended. What?
The war in 1914-15. After that, things became too bitter between the two sides. At the time, people the soldiers kind of had like friends and been killed by them, and they're not going to want to go with truce to people whom they knew killed loved ones in the horror not loved ones, but friends in the horror they've seen. So it kind of was only a thing that happened early in the war, but it's still notable. Mm-hmm. There were also.
I want to mention that the Austro-Hungarian. I didn't mention the general. They had a field marshal named Conrad von Hotzendorf, who was he was a little bit like Luigi Cardona in that he kind of blunders at points, and so he's just kind of not like a cool guy, but he was kind of like the figurehead for their army for a while, and he led certain campaigns pretty well up until a point. And that's kind of that. If you want to think of a figurehead for their army, that's Conrad and Hotzendorf. That's all I'm saying.
Well, yeah, definitely. There was also, surprisingly for how brutal the war was, there was a mutiny once by French troops, but ultimately there was not that much insubordination, considering kind of the brutality of the war.
Yeah, I heard that the French like supply corps and like the people that were like the engineer corps and all this. I mean, obviously these terms come a little bit later, but like the idea of non-combatants helping, the war effort. That was like really good in World War I. And in fact, they made like a replica of Paris outside of Paris to distract bombers so that the bombers would fly by Paris and the Germans, and they would think that these giant structures were the actual city. So people like were putting effort into helping France. The French people specifically. It wasn't like there was a military dictatorship and then the people were being suppressed or something. It was actually a very unified movement, the whole war.
Well, yeah, and another thing I was going to mention is,
which is not true in Italy, by the way. In Italy, a lot of people didn't want to be involved. It's like the opposite.
Oh, yeah, they were involved. They didn't have a huge role. They did fight the Austrians a little bit in the Alps area, but other than that, they didn't play a huge role, and they didn't also gain a lot from the war like the other, Allied powers were, the Entente, and that's one of the reasons Mussolini became powerful later, because they thought they'd kind of been screwed over in the aftermath. But that's kind of later, like I'll tell.
Do you know much about the Bulgarians? Because I believe the Italians also fought the Bulgarians.
I'm not sure about that. They're kind of in the periphery of the war area, but so the turning point in the war, the Western Front is pretty much been a non-factor at this point, but the Eastern Front is a non-factor. But the turning point in the Western Front was the involvement of the United States, and that the United States, of course. There were thoughts of getting involved, but most of the people, politicians in the United States, did not want to get involved until two events. One was the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. It was actually a British ship, but it carried a lot of American passengers, and people at that time were even warned, hey, you're risking your life getting on a British ship because the Germans are conducting submarine warfare.
And that's what brought the America into the war.
Good amount of American passengers.
That was that was the Pearl Harbor of World War I.
It actually happened in 1915, though, and the United States didn't get involved until 1917. But what was the turning point? It was this thing called the Zimmerman telegram. So kind of people working in the state. I think his name was Zimmerman.
Yeah, I've heard. Yeah, there's a telegram, and it was.
Last name was. But it was sent to Mexico. It was kind of a deal with the Germans saying, hey, if you attack the United States, to get the United States involved in the war by the, by the Allied powers. But it was basically telling Mexico to, hey, if you, declare war on the United States, we'll, help you and distract them. Basically, they say it was intercepted by British intelligence, though. But those two factors and the fact that, a lot of Americans were considering it can be safer to get involved on the side of the British because, even though there was no clear winner, they were still getting an upper hand at that point. Kind of, and America did join the war eventually, and that combined with the Germans basically, facing domestic, a lot of unrest, and the fact that their reserves were really depleted because they had reserves on the eastern front that came to help the western front, but at that point they were just overwhelmed to the point that eventually they had to sue for peace. And once the Americans got involved.
Yeah. It wasn't okay. I mean, I can break it down a little bit because it wasn't that the Americans are necessary to end the war, but we had enough troops. We had enough troops to offer that it was just a sign that the Germans it was hopeless for them. And in fact, I've heard that the American reputation in World War I, in terms of the soldiers and how they fought and how they learned to deal with adversity and adapt to environmental issues and stuff, conflicts in the combat and whatnot, is really good. I've heard that they had a great reputation, but they weren't there that long, the Americans. But even the French, the British, they all thought that they were the Americans were good fighters. But it's just they weren't extremely necessary to end the war. I mean, they were important, but they weren't necessary.
Yeah. The person who
you're cutting out. You're cutting out.
We're talking about the Zimmerman telegram. The person who had Zimmerman said it was actually authentic. It's not.
Yeah, the reason they got into the war was an okay reason, I think.
We might have just been, saying that for some reason, to stroke national pride. They kind of been. Well, yeah, definitely. But so it was around came. The Germans did one final offensive, and then they kind of, were forced to retreat, and eventually, sue for peace. They stopped them from crossing. They stopped the Germans from crossing the Marne, and then they basically began the offensive Moosagel, and that kind of what is considered the final offensive. And eventually, the Germans just agreed to sign an armistice, basically.
Yeah, and November 11th, in 1918, and it wasn't until June of 19.
This will be key to what's understanding.
It wasn't until June of 1919 that they even had the Treaty of Versailles. And of course, they had, the Japanese were there, the Americans were there. It's why are these, minor players in the war attending the Treaty of Versailles? I'm sure people were annoyed that the Americans were there. And Woodrow Wilson's, he came up with the 14 points and later on the League of Nations, but he had to meet with obviously Lloyd George of Britain and George Clemenceau, France, prime minister there, and. It baffles me that Woodrow Wilson was even as prominent in the the treaty negotiations as he was. It really kind of, if you look on YouTube, Woodrow Wilson there's a low opinion of Woodrow Wilson on both sides. Well, don't interrupt me. Don't interrupt me. Give me a second.
Woodrow Wilson actually got very sick after that. Essentially for a lot of the last time of his presidency, his wife was president because he became just sort of non-functional. I think he was dealing with some sort of illness.
Well, apparently, even in modern politics, he's gotten a bad reputation because he was racist. So, liberals really don't like him. But then he was also really pro-government, and he created the income tax and the Federal Reserve, and so conservative people don't like him for that. And so he's a very disliked president on both sides.
That's kind of more separate American history.
Well, yeah, with the Zimmerman thing is that too, but so it doesn't. So, what did you think of Versailles? What's your take on it?
Okay, so I'm just going to describe it. Versailles was a treaty. Obviously, it was heavily biased against Germany because the winner gets to write the best terms. It basically made war reparations mandatory for Germany in some huge amount, like billions, which was right after the war. First of all, the Kaiser was forced to abdicate, like he was no longer sort of a viable figure, and the Weimar Republic was established. But there was also domestic unrest,
and there was a lot of socialism.
There was the Spartacists, which were kind of trying to make the Spartacists were kind of like they were like kind of like the Bolsheviks, German version of the Bolsheviks. They tried to form a revolution against the newly formed government to kind of create a communist state there. And they ultimately ended up getting suppressed by actually the Social Democratic government that was in Germany at the time. They were like sort of center left, suppressing far left kind of people. But after that, internally there was a ton of hyperinflation. Now a lot of people say the hyperinflation was solely due to the Versailles Treaty and how they had to print it, and that's somewhat true. But also the fact is that Germany actually printed a lot of money during the war, but inflation didn't show up because people weren't spending on consumer goods. They were too busy, kind of tending to the war effort.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's interesting. And you're talking about the Spartacist movement. I mean, there was a revolution that was supposed to take place. There's a woman called among the communists. It was a woman called Rosa Luxemburg who kind of led it, and she ended up just getting murdered. It was sort of a failure, but very interesting how it was like the Russian Revolution in Germany, but it didn't end up that way. It could have been, but it didn't go that way. Before you talk about the hyperinflation, before you talk about the hyperinflation, I want to say that the British had their own fears of Bolshevism, and they had a lot of communist sympathizers in the Labour Party. And it's really interesting how basically everywhere except for France and Italy, there's this communist sort of inclination at the end of the war. But yeah, go on.
Well, yeah, the Red Scare was up instead of the thing that happened in America, but it happened.
You're cutting out. You're cutting out. I can't hear you. I can't hear you at all. You're cutting. I can't hear you, Evan. You're cutting out.
What happened in Russia?
Okay.
Even the timing.
Evan, you're cutting out. I couldn't hear anything you just said.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry. So the Red Scare was all across all of Europe. People talk about it in America, but there were fears of communist revolutions and that, and these movements started to gain a lot of crackdowns on them in Europe after what happened in Russia. But there wasn't Britain. I mean, France obviously was pretty happy after when they gained a lot of what they called their national pride.
It wasn't called the Red Scare until after World War II. I think at this point they just called it Bolshevism. Could be mistaken.
Yeah, France. They gained back their national pride, but their economy was.
But even the I want to say about Versailles with the French is that their leader, their war leader, Evan, you're cutting out.
But then they thought it was worth it, I guess.
Evan, you're cutting out a lot. Evan, you're cutting out a lot.
Are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. You're cutting out. I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm not. I wasn't talking.
Oh, okay. Oh, so I was saying is that the Ferdinand Foch, who is the leader of the French military at this point, mostly the army, he at the Treaty of Versailles, he said that this is not an armistice. Sorry, this isn't a peace treaty. This is an armistice for 20 years. And he ended up being prophetic because within 20 years, World War II would break out, or a little bit more than 20 years. World War II would break out, and he was an interesting guy because he was the leader. Not a lot of people know he's not a household name, but he was basically the leader of the French army during all of World War II. Ferdinand Foch, World War I.
And another thing we should bring up when we talk about the end of the war is the Spanish flu. That was actually a major factor that isn't talked about a ton. So I think people knew it's a form of influenza. It's like killed like way more people than COVID now. I mean, like it was pretty bad. But so during the war, it actually didn't start in Spain. Most people do not think it did. But what happened was the governments of most of the countries involved in the war suppressed the news because they didn't want the troops to become, kind of just the morale to go down. But Spain was neutral in the war, so they actually reported on it, and the kind of then it became a huge problem. And like they say, that kind of made the urgency to end the war just a lot more, urgent, I would say. But it ends up killing millions of people by the end of it done. I mean, it often kind of, gets subsumed into the history of the era, but it was a really major, kind of event.
Yeah, Spain is interesting, as a side, is just well, I'll digress in a sec, but as a short aside, Spain's interesting because they didn't participate in World War I or World War II. They were neutral, basically, in both instances.
Like the Spanish Civil War then.
Yeah, but the Spanish Civil War was very brief, it was only a 3-year thing. They really lucked out. I don't know how they got away with it. But yeah.
And other than that, okay, what are you gonna say?
Well, yeah, but the reason it's called the Spanish flu is because the first documented cases in journalism, in the press, were in Spain. But that doesn't mean that the virus itself originated there, and we experts acknowledge that now.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Yeah. So you understand.
So kind of like the Paris Peace Conference was probably the biggest thing at the end of World War I. I mean, that's kind of a little separate from the Treaty of Versailles, but it kind of made the terms for the victors and against the kind of the Central Powers. I mean, first of all, the Ottoman Empire was gone by then. It was just Turkey by then. Also, Austria-Hungary was dissolved. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved. There was just Austria and a bunch of other countries, and probably what would be considered like today's countries.
Yeah, so I'll touch on that briefly. The Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, sort of the whole Sultanate collapsed. There was a Young Turk movement that had earlier origins, but during World War I, it was gaining more and more steam. Eventually, Kemal Ataturk was a general in World War I. They had other generals too, but he ended up being the most famous because in the afterward he led the Young Turk Revolution, and that reorganized Ottoman Empire to be just the Republic of Turkey, and it was designed as a secular government. And the thing that was interesting is that you go to like Ankara, which is the capital of Turkey now. They have a humongous like a monument to Ataturk, Kemal Ataturk.
Yeah,
it's bigger. It's like the size of. Wait, let me finish. You're interrupting me. It was the size of the Lincoln Memorial, but maybe times like 5. It literally looks like a pyramid. Or ziggurat or something. It was just like one of my professors is living in Ankara right now, and she's Turkish, and she showed us footage of what it looks like. It's really humongous. It's almost like overblown. Like it's hard to even believe people would have that much pride in like one person. You go to Napoleon's tomb, it's nothing like that.
Oh yeah, and the biggest thing Turkey probably did during the war was what's called today the Armenian Genocide, which was
yeah, exactly. That was the most lasting memory.
They were against the kind of other powers. And Armenians, they had a lot of sympathies towards Russia, and so the Turks, especially, they wanted to create like both in regards that they wanted to create kind of more like a more homogenous Turkish state, and they considered Armenians kind of a threat of subversion because they were more sympathetic to Russians. They made them go on long sort of death marches and also did executions, but the Turkish government still denies it today.
Yeah, and they haven't had a lot of. No one was imprisoned for this. There was no Nuremberg of the era for them. Like it was like totally just like an oversight by the Western Europe. And the other thing is they didn't just kill Armenians, but they also killed other ethnic groups like minorities, like the Greeks. The Greeks, which is like ironic because they literally stole the land from the Greeks. And then now they're murdering them. It's like really horrific. But it was 100 years ago. I guess people don't care as much anymore. It's still an atrocity.
And, so Austria-Hungary is built up. Italy didn't get as much as they wanted out of it, like the other powers. So that's one of the reasons, like I said earlier, that fascism became a lot more prominent, even though they're on the victor side, not the loser side. But there are other places, like there was a very short-lived communist revolution in Hungary, which was kind of a newly formed independence there, and it didn't last that long. It was ultimately suppressed, and
Yeah, because Hungary got separated from Austria finally.
Yeah, but other than that, so the end of World War One, it didn't redraw like the map as much as Vienna, but politically, especially when you consider World War II and its aftermath, it does have like even more significance.
But you're forgetting about the most important country, Evan.
Yeah.
Yugoslavia was created. United Slavia, dude. Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, it was all united. And it lasted a long time.
Yeah, it lasted until the 90s. I mean, after that was kind of,
Well, yeah, what it was after it lasted kind of until Tito, their leader, died, and he was kind of this personality that kept it all together. And then when he died, they were just, I don't know, the ethnic groups were like kind of disunited in terms of temperament or whatever. I don't know what. And then, of course, the Iron Curtain collapsed, and that was the final blow.
Yeah, that's a lot later. I think we got a good run over of kind of World War One and its aftermath. And next one, we'll be talking about the interwar period between probably around 1920 to 1939. So that should wrap up this part of the podcast, which from 1914 to 1920.
Yeah, it should. Couple of things I wanted to say about it is that, a lot of people are starting to not like millions of people, but a lot of experts are starting to view World War I and World War II as kind of the same conflict, as like a super conflict, rather than just separating World War I and World War II. But that doesn't mean that we should just decompartmentalize and just view it all as some sort of economic structure. We should really view World War I as its own entity, I think, because World War I had a lot of meaning, mostly in the way that Europe changed, and also in the way that it destroyed the economy.
Changed after that too.
Culture, yeah, it really was the first. It was the first war that truly mechanized Europe, or even the world.
Yeah, so I think that should wrap it up.
Yeah, we were at the 50-minute mark, so we're doing pretty good. All right, I'm going to end it right now.